name is Gene Gwill. Yes.
That was here.
Well, that was going to be a big hint if nobody got it. It happened on this date, and it happened on this site.
The British government was rejected, and the colonists were, they agreed, I got your sign out for them. The colonists agreed that the democratic form of government could continue.
Yes. This was the date of the Body of the People protest, which occurred at this courthouse on the front lawn on the morning of September the 27th, 1774. A band of patriots assembled in Sandwich early in the morning. They walked from Sandwich to Barnstable to the courthouse. By the time they got here, their numbers exceeded 1,500. Their leader stood in the doorway, which would have been where that window is, and prevented Chief Justice James Otis Sr. from entering the building. The patriots were protesting the intolerable acts and the conditions that said all jurors must be selected by the town sheriff, who was appointed by the king, ultimately. So they felt like their rights as Englishmen were undermined. They protested. They discussed it with Chief Justice Otis. He agreed. And through this peaceful protest, the courts, basically the British court system on Cape Cod, was terminated. No court was held in this building again until after the Revolution started. This event predated the battles of Lexington and Concord by about 6 months and had tremendous implications for the founding of our country in terms of a democratic form of government. So, the Body of the People protest. If you have not done so, Tales of Cape Cod created a 9-minute video which describes the history of this building and the significance of the Body of the People protest. This video is available on our website, and we actually won a Telly Award for that video. Our speaker this evening is Michael Tougias. Michael is the author and co-author of 30 books for adults and 7 books for children. Tonight he will talk about King Philip's War, a cataclysmic, often overlooked war, which on a per capita basis was the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history. Michael is the author of the acclaimed book, Until I Have No Country, a novel about King Philip's War. He also co-authored with Eric Schultz, King Philip's War, the History and Legacy of America's Forgotten Conflict. Edith Andrews, the former Commissioner of Indian Affairs for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and a member of the Wampanoag tribe, has said, Until I Have No Country captures the essence of the Native American. Michael's latest 2 books are Above and Beyond, JFK and America's Most Dangerous Spy Mission, and a memoir, which he will touch upon tonight, entitled The Waters Between Us, A Boy, a Father, Outdoor Misadventures, and the Healing Power of Nature. Michael also co-authored the book, The Finest Hours, which was the true story of the Coast Guard's most daring rescue. This was co-authored with Casey Sherman and turned into a movie, a Disney movie, about 3 or 4 years ago. Michael's books are available this evening. Titcomb's is selling his latest books here at the table, and Michael has brought earlier books, and they're available in the reception room. I wish to thank our sponsors for this evening's program, Vincent Miles and Heather Campbell. This program is also made possible by a grant from the town of Barnstable, the Hyannis Chamber of Commerce Tourism Grant. Next week, we have a change in plans. Instead of the program which appears in our brochure, we are pleased to present the popular author Martin Sandler. Marty will come back and talk with us about the latest developments in the archaeological work for the widow and how this has expanded our understanding of the pirate ship. With no further ado, I'll turn the program over to Michael.
Coming out. I did this program recently at a school, and I was showing the slides from King Philip's War, and these were third graders. And at the end, I asked any questions, and a little girl raised her hand, and she said, "Weren't you afraid?" I said, "I'm not that old." So this event happened in 1675 to 1676. And we'll take you through it with the slides. And before I get started, I do a newsletter once a year. So if you're interested, you can put your email. Here's for this half of the room and this half of the room. And so the latest two books for adults that I've done, the first one is Above and Beyond, and this is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 4 lesser-known stories that had us about this far away from nuclear war. Most people don't realize that the Soviets shot down and killed one of our pilots over Cuba. I didn't know it until I stumbled upon the story. And then that led me further into it. The 3 other events. One was a Soviet sub that actually loaded their nuclear torpedo, and the commander said fire, and if it wasn't for another Russian on board, he would have. A third incident is one of our U-2 pilots got lost over the Soviet Union. He was supposed to be going over the North Pole, but the Northern Lights screwed up his celestial navigation, if you will. And I'll surprise you with the book on the fourth one, but none of these I knew about. I always thought, oh, Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy handled that really well, and nobody lost their life. Well, there's more to the story. And then the book that Kit Combs had brought, the new one, The Waters Between Us, that is a prequel to this earlier book called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. And the subtitle is The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. So this book, it won the Independent Publisher's Best Nature Book of the Year when it came out. So I always thought about doing a sequel or a prequel, and I decided to tackle the prequel first. So The Waters Between Us is in the same kind of Bill Bryson theme of humor. It follows me, it's a memoir, it follows me from age 12 to 22, the relationship I had with my father. I probably had attention deficit disorder, and it was never diagnosed at the time because I was a wild kid, always in trouble. But the story, as you get more towards the tail end of the book, takes a serious turn. How did my father react to a terrible car accident my sister was in? And just to give you an idea of just his devotion, he took care of my sister at home for 40 years. And he always told me, I don't want you to write a book about me. Well, after he passed away, I said, I gotta do this book because it's tied into this growing up period. And that made me grow up in a real hurry. Up until then, I was probably the most immature kid on the planet. But watching how my father handled this with grace, how he never became bitter, he always kept his sense of humor, I said, I can't do the story without including that in there. So that's why I say the Waters Between Us doesn't fit one genre. You know, it bounces around. The first part is a lot like There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse, these funny outdoor stories, but then it takes a more serious turn. I always remember my dad saying, I would say, why don't you want me to do a book that includes you? And he said, a lot of people do what I'm doing. And I know they do because I've heard from caregivers since this book has come out. But I thought it was important to show how he handled that. So I'm going to get going with the slides, and then maybe at the end, if there's time, just a couple questions, but I'll answer more in the other room. I'll use the microphone here. So when I was writing about King Philip's War, the first book I did was Until I Have No Country. And so all the events in this book are true, but the lead character is fictional. So that allowed me to create the dialogue. And I had been doing a lot of research over the years for this book, and then I got a nice letter from a gentleman by the name of Eric Schultz, who said, I'm working on a book too. And I'm a pack rat, so I keep everything. And later, a publisher approached me about doing a straight history of the war. And I recalled Eric's letter, found it, called him up, and he was much farther along than I was, so we joined forces. But Eric really was the mastermind, and I was almost more like the agent. And then I put in, at the back of this book, are 3 diaries from people who lived through the war, so you get a firsthand account, and I'll introduce you to those 3 people. So before the Europeans came, here's where some of the tribes were located. In the Wampanoags, there's sub-tribes of the Wampanoags. The one that Philip, who is, by the way, his native name is Metacom. So if you hear me say King Philip or Metacom, I'm talking about the same person. And I think that's why so many people are thrown off and have not learned about this war, because they just see the word King Philip and they think it's an English king, but it's a Native American. And so he was a member of the Pokanoket sub-tribe of the Wampanoags. The Massachusetts tribe was really hit hard by disease introduced by early European explorers and fishermen. So that's why when the Pilgrims finally found their way to Plymouth after stopping on the Cape, they found some fields that had been cleared, 4 or 5 years earlier. It was the folks who had been decimated by disease. So a little bit about the Native Americans, the Algonquins. That's the umbrella term for Native Americans here in New England. They lived in these structures that they called wetus. We call them wigwams, but very effective during the winter to keep that heat in. Between a little fire in the center, there's a smoke hole on the top, and just body heat, and you'd put a flap over the door. They were pretty snug. And you see in the front there's a grinding stone, so they were an agricultural-based people, growing corn, squash, pumpkins, beans. I had a mentor when I was really doing a lot of research with this book. It was an archaeologist named Stanley. You'll see a picture later. We found this axe head right in Plymouth, in a sand pit in Plymouth. And Stanley went on to discover one of only 3 Paleo-Indian sites in Massachusetts. And so the Paleo-Indians are the first known human inhabitants to come in after the Ice Age. So if you see a big white pine tree like this, the natives would look at it and they'd also see dugout canoe. And here in southern New England, they would use dugout canoes. In northern New England, where you have the larger birch trees, they would use the birch bark canoes. There are some patches of old-growth forest left in Massachusetts. One of the best is at Mohawk Trail State Forest. So they've got some hemlocks there that are up to 400 years old, some white pines in excess of 300 years old. There's Stanley demonstrating one of the Paleo-Indians' first tools or weapons, if you will, the addle-addle or the throwing stick. So when he brings his arm forward, he doesn't let go of the throwing stick, but the spear goes flying off it with that extra leverage. He made me a whole bunch of these back in the day, and I could stand at one goalpost of a football field and almost hit the other goalpost. That's how accurate they are. And I remember saying, these are amazing. And he goes, this was man's first step to the moon. And I always remember that line of his. This is a friend, Wes. He's an Abenaki Indian. And I like to include this slide to remind all of us that when we get into the King Philip's War part of the presentation, the natives did have muskets. And they could even repair a broken musket, could manufacture the balls, but they couldn't manufacture gunpowder. So that became an issue as the war dragged on. Natives would hunt the deer, and when Stanley taught me how to flake an arrowhead using quartz, or different chert is another good stone for it, but he would use the deer antler. And the Native Americans wouldn't think of killing a deer without utilizing every aspect of its body. One of the books that I used in my research, and this is one you could probably find at the library, it was written in 1631 by William Wood, and it's called New England Prospect. And it's a little bit like a travelogue encouraging more English to come to the New World. And he says, There's this great beast here in the New World, and we call it the moose, and it will soon be plowing all our fields. He thought because it looked like a horse, we're going to domesticate it like a horse, so that never worked out. But it is a fascinating read to see what New England looked like at that time period. For example, Champlain commented on this too. He said the trees are so big in the New World, you could march an army underneath them. It's like going through a park. In other words, they're blocking out the sunlight, so there's very little undergrowth in these old-growth forests. I think our clicker might have just died on us here. Let's try going the other direction. Oh. The natives would raid muskrat lodges to get the roots and the tubers inside. They wouldn't kill the muskrat because they needed to do it the next year. And, we would call that conservation. They called it survival. This is Long Ditch. My very first book was a book about a journey down the whole 80 miles of the Charles River. And Long Ditch connects one part of the Charles with another, where it's draining some lowlands in the town of Dedham. And it's amazing. This was dug in 1650, but it's straight as an arrow today. And if you know where this is, you could take a shortcut and bypass 6 miles of the river. You can canoe right down this. The colonists were changing the landscape, with those ditches to drain out the wetlands, to grow the valuable hay for their cattle. The mills, I do a lot of hiking, and every stream, if you look carefully enough, eventually you will find signs of a mill. Usually the one thing you'll see from the early days is where the earthen dam was. It'll be breached, but you'll still see part of it. So even the smallest streams, they would build mill sites on. Back up the water. This is the Gilbert Stewart Mill down in Wickford, Rhode Island. So they'd back up the water in the stream. It would create the holding pond, open up the sluiceway, and the pond would power the mill. So the Pilgrims, when they came, they didn't go straight to Plymouth. It was here at Cape Cod. In another presentation, I talk much more about this period. But, one of the reasons they left Cape Cod was a skirmish with the natives here. And you can't blame the natives because they'd already seen some other Englishmen who had kidnapped some natives, and the Pilgrims had dug up some Indian corn at either a burial site or an abandoned village. So they were under surveillance, and at First Encounter Beach, the natives led an attack. No one was killed or injured, but that was one of several reasons the Pilgrims got back on the Mayflower and went to Plymouth. So as the colony started expanding, they always built the town commons, and the reason they're called common is it's common land. Anybody could use it as night pasture. You could bring in your sheep and cattle and keep them safe at night in the center of town. The really good town commons still have the fence around it. This is one in Grafton. There's my daughter. She's about 7 now. She's about 33, living in Hong Kong and London. But she came with me on all my research trips, and I think that made her so bold to just take a job in Hong Kong and not know a soul there. Gave her that wanderlust. Right now she's in Spain working. So the natives did have one thing the colonists wanted, and that was the beaver skins, the pelts, because the fashion back in England was you would use a beaver pelt for the fur lining on your collar of a winter coat or a beaver hat. So there was an active trade going on, and the natives wanted these steel implements that the colonists brought over. And this was one of the first trading posts, the Uptuxet trading post. This is a recreation of it in Bourne, right adjacent to the Cape Cod Canal. But back when it was built in 1627, there was no Cape Cod Canal, but I learned there were these two rivers that came close together, so this was kind of a natural place to put it, because with a short portage, you could get from, say, the Scusset River to the next one and get down into Buzzards Bay. And out in front a while back, they had the stocks, and in my research, I found how intolerant the Puritans were, especially the ones who settled Boston and westward. For example, if you were a Quaker and you spoke up too loudly about your religious viewpoints, one of the penalties was to be put in the stocks. And if you still talked about it, the Puritans would take a hot iron spike and bore it through the middle of your tongue so you could never speak again. So it was a really intolerant group. And it's ironic, they came here for their religious freedom, but not for anybody else's. And so Quakers moved out, and that's why you don't see Quaker meeting houses west of the Boston area. They're down near the Rhode Island border, where Roger Williams had a much more open and free society, and a much better relationship with the Native Americans of Rhode Island, most of which were Narragansetts.
Where is that?
This one was taken in Dartmouth, Mass., so right, close to Rhode Island. And the South Natick Dam, this is looking just below the dam. This was the site of the big praying Indian community where the Reverend John Eliot was converting natives to Christianity. The experiment was actually going pretty good. They had their farms, and when King Philip's War broke out, these natives just wanted to stay out of the whole thing. But again, the Puritans suspected them, so they put them out on Deer Island, didn't give them enough food or shelter, and scores died from exposure and starvation on Deer Island. And they were neutral. So what did King Philip look like? He didn't look like this, and I remember when the first edition of King Philip's War came out, this was on the cover, and I said, well, that's, not according to the eyewitness reports, and the publisher said, do you have anything better? And interestingly, nobody had done a sketch or a painting of him while he was alive. They were all done 50, 60 years later when there was still great interest in this war. This was supposed to be King Philip. I always thought looked like a Roman gladiator. And then this one I like, though, by Phil Cote, Sculpture in Central Mass. And I remember I said, why did you give him that faraway look in the eyes, which is kind of amazing that in a piece of bronze you could capture that. And he said, I was trying to capture Metacom at the closing days of the war. And in the closing days of the war, Metacom's wife and young son had both been captured by the English. So I think that's what he was trying to convey. that the battle was lost. So the next group of slides are going to get into the war. So it begins in June of 1675. And this is not a little 2 or 3 month affair. This goes on for 14 months. And in the early days, the natives are winning. So if you're a Native American, then it's a tough choice. If you join, you know you're going up against the mighty English with all their technologically advanced weapons. But if you do nothing, the status quo is going to continue, and it's a slow spiral of decline for the Wampanoags and the other tribes. A couple like flashpoints, if you will, that occurred before the war that probably set it on the path. One was the death of John Sassamon. He was a Native American who worked as an interpreter for the English. He'd been educated by the English and could speak both languages. His body was found under the ice at Assawampset Pond. And the English version of events states that he was murdered by some of King Philip's followers. They suspected him of treachery. And we'll never know the truth, but the English did round up 3 of Metacom's closest aides, took them to Plymouth, had a trial, found all 3 guilty, and hung all 3. So that had to be a flashpoint where Metacom knows that it's the English laws governing the land, not the Native American. And, this Metacom, the fascinating thing about it is his father was Massasoit. So it's kind of this cruel irony that Massasoit's the one who lets the Pilgrims get established. You could have wiped them out within half an hour. But now it's his son trying to drive them out as they've become so populous. So
where is this?
why don't we hold all the questions to the end, okay? Because some of these, probably some questions will be answered. So this is Metacom's headquarters. This is down in Bristol, Rhode Island. Brown University owns this little patch of land. It's we call it Mount Hope. The natives called it Montauk, which means the high place, a little bit of a hill. And Massasoit as well lived nearby. And then this is called King Philip's Seat. So I'm sitting in this little ledge of rock, and legend has it that this is where he would address the tribe. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but he had to rule by consensus. It wasn't, even though the English called him a king, that was their word for leader, and he was a leader, but he wasn't like a king. He couldn't say, okay, we're going to war tomorrow. He'd have to convince everybody, listening to him and get consensus. So, his powers during King Philip's war kind of ebbed and flowed. Sometimes he was listened to, sometimes he was not. So the Pokanoket Band, when they read Until I Have No Country, they invited me to their ceremony, and people often think I might be part Native American, but I don't have a drop of blood. And if I did, it would be the Pequots because they own Foxwoods. But I said, can I bring my camera? And they said yes. And part of their celebration was how they got the kids involved. And they'd have one child shoot an arrow off into the woods. The other kids would run and find it. Whoever found it first was the honorary leader for the next celebration. But that child who found the arrow got extra homework about the culture and the tribe. So that's how they hoped to keep it alive. And it was kind of an interesting way to get the kids involved because they all wanted to be the ones to find the arrow. So the war breaks out when some Wampanoags attack the town of Swansea. They had had enough of English cattle getting free, trampling their corn, eating their crops. So they went into Swansea without Metacom's blessing and killed some cattle. And there was a farmer and a young man there who saw what was happening. The young man fired the musket ball that killed one of the natives, and then boom, the war started. So my research indicated that Metacom really wasn't ready for the war to start, but whether he liked it or not, it began. He was still in negotiations trying to get the Narragansetts to join, and they had refused to this point and continued to refuse. And the first person to show up after the attack on Swansea with a group of militia was Benjamin Church. And he's this kind of swashbuckling figure who later, with the aid of his son, wrote back then they called everything that was nonfiction a diary. But he wrote a diary of his involvement in King Philip's War. So that was one of the primary accounts we put at the back of the book with Eric Schultz. And he leads a band after Metacom, who had taken his people across the swamp, away from Mount Hope, and now he's in the area of Tiverton, Rhode Island, Little Compton, Rhode Island, and Metacom's in the swamp hiding because he knows the English are coming to arrest him. And Church walks right into an ambush. And the only reason I believe that Church and his men weren't wiped out is this was the first real skirmish of the war, so it wasn't yet this all-or-nothing mentality, because the natives let him escape, and they should not have done that, because he later becomes really effective at fighting against the Indians because he's got Native American allies on his side, because he doesn't want to walk into another ambush. And he's espousing that. He's trying to tell the Puritans, have Native Americans with you when you go after the Wampanoags. And they do not listen to him in the early part of the war. So this was the Peasefield skirmish. So this is one of the first ones. Church, he runs down to the rocks there and hides behind those. And he's saved by a ship that had a couple canoes on board by Captain Gould. And one of the reasons I like going to these sites and that Eric and I held out with the book until we found a publisher that would put the maps in case you want to visit the sites, is a lot of them are still in beautiful settings, like Benjamin Church's grave in Little Compton. It's right off the town common. It's a beautiful town, Little Compton and Tiverton. This little plaque shows that in Dartmouth, this garrison was attacked and burned down. So even though Metacom is hiding in the swamp, he's still at night hitting nearby towns with attacks. And usually they never could gain control of a garrison because they're well fortified, but in this time they did. But Metacom realizes, I can't just hide in this swamp forever. Eventually they're going to surround me and capture me or kill me. So if you follow those red arrows, that's the first few weeks of the war, Metacom's path. Leaves Mount Hope, doesn't want to be trapped on that peninsula, then curls up through Tiverton and Little Compton, and then he hears that the Nipmucks have attacked and burned the town of Mindenmass, which is where I live now, and he knows he's got an ally because he didn't coordinate that attack. The Nipmucks did it on their own. They were out for revenge. So he realizes, I've got to get to the Nipmucks to join my people with them and continue this battle. So he likely came up the Blackstone River. That would make sense. There is a King Philip Rock there. There's King Philip Rocks, if you look carefully, in like every other town. King Philip Cave, King Philip Rock. It's kind of like George Washington slept here. I don't think he all these places, but certainly Native Americans were probably seen there during King Philip's War, and they named him after the one native that they knew the name of. So this is that that overlook, and you're looking down on the Blackstone River. So it's likely he came this way as he's heading towards the central part of the state to join up with the Nipmucs. And here we are in central Mass on the banks of the Ware River. This is in Hardwick, New Braintree, beautiful little towns. Years ago, I wrote a book about the construction of Quabbin Reservoir and how 4 towns were obliterated so that Boston and the suburbs could get more water. But I also, in the second half of the book, I put in a bunch of journeys that you might want to travel on, just beautiful countryside. And this is one. This was the big area where the Winnemesset village was, where the Nipmucs lived. And so when Metacom arrives, the Nipmucs are celebrating because they've not only burned Mendon to the ground, they've had a successful attack on Brookfield, which back then encompassed many more towns than just Brookfield. And the way the natives did it, there were some soldiers stationed in the garrison, and I guess I shouldn't use the word soldiers, militia. So there were no soldiers from England helping the colonists, not a one. So these are local people taking up arms against the natives. And they were supposed to meet some of the Winnemesset leaders at this location, and it was dawn, the natives weren't there. A couple of the militiamen smelled trouble. They said, let's get back to the garrison. But 3 people from the Brookfield said, no, we know where the Winnemesset village is, let's go there. There was no way the natives were going to let these militiamen with muskets on horseback, some even had armor on back then to kind of impress the natives with their power. And so they walked right into an ambush, and Captain Wheeler was shot off his horse. His son was there, though, also on horseback, and rescued him. And so Captain Wheeler's account is also at the back of the book. And Wheeler said, we made it to the garrison with the natives hot on our heels, and the natives then proceeded to burn every house in Brookfield, and when they turned their attention to the garrison, we got lucky. And by that, he meant it started to rain. So no matter what they did, they would push these big wagons on fire into the garrison house. It just would not catch fire. So that's the only reason that Wheeler survived and was able to write about his account. So if you visit that site, that's in West Brookfield. There is a sign there where Major Wilson was killed. And there is, even in the woods, maybe 15 feet off the road, is an old Benjamin Franklin mile marker. It says 67 miles from Boston, 36 to Springfield. So back, after King Philip's War, if mail was being sent, you were charged by the mile. If you do visit that area and you have kids, this is an interesting place to take them. The Rock House Reservation. A lot of Native American artifacts were found under this overhang because it serves as a shelter. And this is in West Brookfield also, trustees of the reservation property. So now you've got the 2 tribes teaming up. Some stay in that greater Winnemesset area near Brookfield. Others, though, head up to the Connecticut River, and near the Great Falls, we call it Turner's Falls, they began attacking towns like Northfield to the north, Deerfield to the south, and then they go right down the river and burn a good deal of Springfield, Mass down as well. And I grew up in Springfield and Longmeadow, Mass, and this would have been the perfect topic to teach us as kids, and yet was never even mentioned in elementary school, middle school, or high school. And Longmeadow was attacked, but they just kind of swept it under the rug. So Bloody Brook occurs when natives have kind of had the town of Deerfield surrounded, except for the people holding out in the garrison. So volunteers from Hadley and Northampton come up to rescue those people, and they expect trouble on the way up, but nothing happens. And they're able to get the people out of the garrison and get the grain, because, we're into the fall now. Again, it began in the spring, 1675. We're into the fall. And they load up the wagons with the people and the grain, and they start heading south. And they make the mistake of letting their guard down, thinking, well, there's no natives around. Because when they reach this area near Muddy Brook, there's two hills on the side. This is a wood carving from the period. And the natives, they must have known the wagons were going to get stuck in the mud at Muddy Brook, because this is where they were going to spring the ambush. And they did, and it was a disaster for the English. 76 English people were killed here, which, back then is a huge loss. And it's kind of par for the course in the early part of the war that the English keep walking into these ambushes and not taking Benjamin Church's advice. So they're buried on the town common of South Deerfield. So a lot of people know Deerfield from the French and Indian Wars later on, but they were also involved in King Philip's War. And many of those who were killed are under this monument. So if you're ever going, say, up Route 91 towards Vermont, stop at South Deerfield. You can also drive to the top of Mount Sugarloaf, and it's got a beautiful view looking down. You're looking at Sunderland here. I did a book about the Connecticut River, and I remember the kayaking through here was amazing. And when I was writing Until I Have No Country, I'd go to the places where the action is set, and I realized not much has changed in all this time. You still have an isolated farm along the rich floodplains of the river. I put this slide in for the kids. I say, this was the no man's land. This is Mount Greylock, separating the Mohawks from the Algonquin tribes. And I tell them, if you look carefully, there's a profile of a Native American looking, the way I am, this way, with the mouth curved down. And then they have to tell me everything they see. A polar bear's head coming out of the water, a great white coming out of the water. But it's a way to kind of keep them engaged as you're going through the history of the war. So I threw this slide in, and it's a photo put on its side. So it's sideways, but it's showing the rock reflecting off the water. So the water is to the right, the rock's reflecting on it, but in the middle is a totem pole of heads. And I tell the kids, if you look carefully, right dead center is the head of an alien. And it's all because the slide's been tipped on its side. Now back to the war. The two tribes are winning. We're into November, December, and they control a good hunk of central Massachusetts, some of the Pioneer Valley. And so the colonists do something very surprising. When I remember, 30 years ago when I started this, even longer than that, I'm going, why would the colonists go after the Nipmucks if they're losing the war and the Nipmucks are neutral? Well, they must have figured that the Nipmucks were going to join with Metacom eventually, and they knew the Nipmucks were very strong, the most powerful tribe in New England, so they figured we need to hit the Nipmucks in a sneak attack. It's almost like a Pearl Harbor sneak attack before they can join up with Metacom. So the colonies unite, and this sneak attack is very effective. It happens down in Charleston, Rhode Island, at the Great Swamp. There is a sign there. We put it in the book, but it is hard to find, so if you do try and find it, be patient. There's all these little things that hop into my head from years ago. I remember I interviewed Ella Seketow, who was the Narragansett historian for the tribe. And I remember sitting down, my dad was with me, and I remember sitting with her and saying, so tell me about the Great Swamp Fight, the Native American traditions of the fight. And she kind of looks me in the eye and she goes, you mean Great Swamp Massacre. And she goes, this was not a fight. We were a neutral tribe, and this was a sneak attack on women and children. And 350 Narragansetts were killed in this sneak attack. So that's why she was so, vehement about don't call it a fight. But from the colonial standpoint, they called it a fight because they suffered a lot of casualties. There was one way into this Native American enclosure, and that was over the log. And the first people to go over the log were picked right off by the natives when they realized they were being attacked. But they did get in, the colonists. And against Benjamin Church's, again, his counsel, the colonists just torched the entire village. Church wanted the Englishmen to take over the wigwams and use this as their new base of operation to do kind of a mop-up work against the remaining Narragansetts. But he was overruled. And so hidden in the woods there where the event happened is a monolith to the Native American nation, the Narragansetts, and then the attacking colonies are the smaller stones. So the survivors, Church wrote, were taken here to Smith's Castle, which was a garrison at the time in Wickford. And he explained that many were wounded and that there was a raging blizzard going on. And I was able to find some eyewitness accounts besides Church's, and I am convinced the winters were much, much colder back then, so much more snowfall. It was really difficult to go from the Great Swamp Battle all the way to the garrison. So many of the wounded died, and if you visit Smith's Castle, they're buried in a mass grave behind the garrison house. So, the natives from the Narragansett tribe, if you think about it, they go from owning most of Rhode Island, having a good relationship with Roger Williams, to, at the end of the war, they're just down to a few acres. So it's just a disaster for the Narragansetts, but they're sucked right into it by that sneak attack. This always captured my attention, Mary Rowlandson's Tale of Captivity. She was from Lancaster, and I wondered, why was she being moved? She called them, the first remove, the second remove, all the way up into Vermont. And as I studied her account further, I realized it's because the natives needed food. They had to keep moving. They were so busy fighting the prior summer, they weren't able to grow their usual amount of crops. So now, during the dead of winter, they don't have all the dried corn and the other foodstuffs. So this is one attack where the natives were successful getting into a garrison, and they took Rowlandson, some of her children, captive. Usually attacking the garrisons, I don't think was a good strategic move on the part of the natives, because the garrisons are well fortified, extra muskets, ammunition, water. They would even put bricks in the walls so no Native American musket balls could come through. But eventually she's released. She does have a conversation with Metacom. She's the only English person that talked to him during the war. But she's released here at Redemption Rock, and this is in Princeton. You can find this just off Route 140. Big, giant glacial erratic that fell off the glaciers. People ask, what was going on in Maine and New Hampshire? Well, they were so sparsely settled. It was just the coastal area. But they were attacked by Abenakis, but without coordination from Metacom. And then at the Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, Mass., they think they've got Metacom's War Club, and I think it just might be his. It looks like it's a rock at the end, but it's all maple inlaid with these triangular pieces of quahog, of wampum. And there's a whole story behind the hand as well. It's in the book. But you've got a Native American base of operations somewhere near Mount Wachusett. Nobody's ever definitively found where that was. But from there, they're leading attacks, and they're getting closer to Boston. So again, even into February and March, it looks like the natives are winning. And the Medfield attack is really dramatic. This is one of the homes that was burned during the attack and rebuilt a couple years later. So it gives you an idea of what the homes looked like. We're now into the winter of 1676. Glass was a luxury, so that's why the windows are very small. This is called the Peak House on Route 109. And there's a story that goes that the natives had infiltrated the town at night and were hiding in some barns. And this one settler goes to his barn early in the morning, and he's, got the pitchfork shoveling some hay to his cattle. And under the hay, he sees the outline of a leg. And he looks more carefully, he sees a moccasin. So he knows there's a native hiding in his barn. And he picks up the pitchfork to kill the native, and he stops and goes, wait a minute, what if there's more than one? They're going to jump me. So he's really cool. He acts like he doesn't see anything, puts the pitchfork down, leaves the barn, runs to the house. It might have been the Peak House, we're not sure. But from here, he does save his family. They're able to escape. There were several natives in the barn, and they take over 18 people from Medfield captive and kill almost an equal number. So we're into the spring, and the Europeans are still walking into ambushes. They lured them into an ambush here, the natives did, by the oldest trick in the book, where you show, just 3 or 4 natives, so the militia thinks, oh, there's only a few, let's get them. And they go charging after them between these 2 hills, and the natives are up in the hills ready to close the vice. So Captain Wadsworth and his men were wiped out here at the Sudbury fight. And they're getting closer and closer to Boston. They do attack Plymouth. Here on the Cape, the Wampanoags, it's a different tribe than the Poconokeets. They tried to stay out of it, and so there was no battles that I'm aware of that occurred on the Cape during King Philip's War. But the natives were able to attack the Clark garrison at Plymouth and were successful. Providence is burned to the ground. All of Roger Williams' work went up in flames. And you would think, okay, the natives are going to hit Boston next, but this is about the time where their efforts run out of steam. And by that I mean they haven't grown enough food, so they're literally starving. In a war of attrition, there's more Europeans in New England than there are natives, and they don't have those technological tools like gunpowder to keep the muskets working. So another bad event befalls them, and that's the leader of the Narragansetts is caught and beheaded, and the English are finally taking Benjamin Church's advice. So here you see the Connecticut English are being led by friendly Niantics and Mohegans. And that truly is the downfall of the Native Americans throughout any war in America, that the tribes were never able to unite. And when they did, at the Little Bighorn, it was too late. Because there, it wasn't just the Sioux, you had Apache, you had Comanche, you had the remnants of tribes all joining together, and you saw what they did to the 7th Cavalry. But the English were so effective at pitting one tribe against each other. And so probably the last major battle was the one at Turner's Falls. And so volunteers from towns like Hadley, Northampton, Springfield join up with Captain Turner to do this surprise attack on the Indian encampment at the Great Falls. And, throughout the eons, natives would gather there because if you had, say, shad or salmon coming up the Connecticut River, they'd hit these big falls, and that was an easy area for the natives to gather fish. And they had a huge village up there. They thought they were safe. They thought they were far enough north, no English would dare to come that far. And there was an English boy was held captive who escaped, and he told Captain Turner, "I don't believe they have any guards posted." And that's what prompted Turner to act really fast and get those volunteers and go up. Some natives in this attack tried to flee across the Connecticut River, but it's May, and the river's really roaring, and if you've ever stopped there, it's kind of an ugly place now because of the hydroelectric plant, but there were these waterfalls, and they were swept right over the falls because of the current. And the way Turner really tricked them was, instead of attacking from the south, he curled up to the north, tethered his horses away from the village, and then swept down from the north, trapping the natives against the bend in the river. So it was very hard for many to escape, but some did. He was able to demolish this Native American village, which was their, I guess you would call it like a resting and resupply place. But some natives regrouped, picked up his trail as he's retreating, and on the very same day that he scores this big victory, Captain Turner is killed. But this breaks the back of the natives. They know there's no place safe in southern New England. So most go north, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, to get away from the English. But we believe that Metacom was at Mount Wachusett. We don't know that for sure. We do know that he did go all the way back to Montauk, the high place. Now, why would he do that, knowing that that's, an area controlled by the English now? My theory, and this is just a theory, is that he knows the war is lost and wants to go down fighting in an area he knows the best. It's his birthplace, his homeland. So he and some followers go down to Montauk. And it's actually some members of Benjamin Church's party that discover his whereabouts. And it's one of his own people who's turned traitor, joined up with Benjamin Church, who kills Metacom when he was sitting by a spring at Montauk. And this marks really the end of most of the warfare at this point, because they've lost their sole remaining leader. So there is a marker where he died, hidden in the woods, and it says, "In the miry swamp, 160 feet west-southwest from this spring, according to tradition, King Philip fell August 12th, 1676, old style." And it was interesting, when I went there, there was two trees joined together right near that spring. It was a birch tree and an ash tree coming out of the same trunk. And it was just interesting. I'd never seen that before. And then he had one kind of lieutenant, if you will, a right-hand man named Anawan, an older leader. And I remember when the Native Americans called me when Until I Have No Country came out, they said, "Your character, Tamaset, is based on Anawan." And I said, "Who's Anawan?" I didn't even know who Anawan was at the time. And they said, "Study up on him." And the similarities are remarkable. So they said that was the spirit when you were trying to capture that period. But he was captured as well. Again, nothing the English told the natives ever was true. Church told him his life would be spared because he gave up without killing any Englishmen here at Anawan Rock. But he was brought to Plymouth and beheaded. So this was, again, a period sketch way back in the day. That's Anawan below. He did have muskets, but he made the mistake. It was kind of drizzling that night, and he didn't want the muskets to be wet, so he put them all in one spot. And when the soldiers moved in the surprise attack, the natives couldn't get to the muskets in time. So I'm going to close on a positive note, because a lot of this is kind of sad when you think about it. But remember how I said I grew up in Longmeadow? Our town was attacked. As a 12-year-old boy, I would have loved to have learned about this. Anything about Native Americans would have been of interest. And they didn't ever bring it up. I learned about it through my dad. But it's interesting in the school systems today. I know they're really pressed with their curriculum and time, but most systems do touch on King Philip's War. So that's why I do go into the schools, because it's just not right to sweep the whole thing under the rug. Because when I went to school, it was the Pilgrims came, we had this great Thanksgiving, natives and Pilgrims together, and then they jumped right to the Revolution. What happened to the French and Indian Wars? What happened to King Philip's War, the Pequot War? But they're trying to rectify that, and that's a good thing. And thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Did you folks want me to take a couple questions?
Please.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Could you expand for us a little bit on the root causes of the war? The
Boy.
threats of
Yeah.
English immigration coming from the English Civil War period,
Right.
actually trying to get more land from the Indians with a sense of racial superiority about it. That would have, I think, really aggravated the situation terribly.
I agree. And oftentimes, the English would buy the land from a Native American, but it was communally owned. No one Native American could sell you communal property. So that caused a ton of issues. Sometimes the Native Americans didn't even know that they were selling full use of the land to their exclusion. They thought, oh, we could still hunt here, and that wasn't the case. So you had a number of factors, that being the main one, loss of tribal land, but also English power is rising in terms of their laws are governing the land. Native American power is declining. So if you're Metacom, what do? It's kind of go for broke or just continue with the status quo, and you could see where that was going to go. So those are two of the biggest issues. Other questions or yep?
Can you speak to why Massasoit was tolerant of the English, almost tolerant?
Yeah, that's a good phrase. Partly for his own purposes, to have an alliance with these newcomers who had these thunder sticks, the muskets, against the more mighty Narragansetts, because those tribes were never in sync. So he's thinking, let's align themselves. There's only a few. And he's the one who gives the blessing for Squanto and Samoset to help them. You wonder, would they have made it without Squanto and Samoset? Showing them how to grow crops, showing them how to gather herring. But, in the end, it's a terrible mistake, and that's why Native Americans today have put up a plaque in Plymouth saying they don't celebrate Thanksgiving. They call it a national day of mourning, that Massasoit was wrong. Other questions? It doesn't have to be on King Philip's War. It can be on the writing and some of the other books or processes. It's a fun career, especially later in your career, where you can write about kind of what you're passionate about and not worry about the sales. When you're young and try to make a living, you have to, but this has been liberating the last few years, as is being in front of a live audience, by the way, after, when you're single in COVID and you're home alone, oh my God, it's tough. Yes?
After King Philip's War, would the Indian nation have any need for military weapons?
Well, certainly, that kind of morphs into the French and Indian Wars, where now the natives have an ally, the French, with all the power that they bring. So I'm certain some of the same natives that fought in King Philip's War have migrated north and are getting their revenge, coming right back down to Massachusetts again. Yep. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I found a quartz spearhead in Sandwich.
Wow.
Were spears only used for war? Because they hunted with bow and arrow, right?
Mostly bow, but did the spear have, not at the pointed end, but at the base, did it have, they call it the fluted base, 2 grooves? If you got that, that's a paleo artifact. So
The point is great, the back is sort of broken off, so I'm not sure how it really ended.
yeah, so you don't know, right.
It's like that big, it's too big to be.
Too big for an arrow, right.
So, what if that was just for war with other Indians?
Yeah, they would use spears, but that was much more rare. Those bigger points were on the atlatls, the throwing stick spears.
Because they weren't fair or anything like that.
Yeah.
Big game.
Hang on to it. Maybe you can have it carbon dated.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'll talk with you in the other room. Thank you.